All right, welcome back. Today, we're jumping headfirst into a really fascinating and honestly pretty controversial ancient text. We're going to explore an argument from a scholar named Ganikaputra that kind of turns a fundamental rule completely on its head. This is a complex one, so let's get right into it.
So let's just kick things off with a pretty provocative question. Do ancient scriptures permit relations with another person's wife? Now, your first instinct is probably to say absolutely not. But what's so interesting about this commentary from Ganikaputra is that the answer he gives is, well, it's way more complicated than a simple no. He lays out a case for a very, very narrow exception.
And this whole exception is built around a concept called the fourth heroine. So let's unpack exactly what this scholar, Ganikaputra, was actually proposing here.
So here's the core idea. Ganikaputra suggested that if, and this is a big if, certain very specific conditions were met, a married woman could, in theory, be seen as a fourth type of partner. And the reasons had to be something other than just pleasure or wanting a son. Notice all the emphasis on specific conditions. This isn't a free pass. It's more like a really complex legal argument. This brings us to a super important term, pakshiki nayaka. You can translate that as the conditional heroine. The key here is the word pakshiki, which basically means something is only true in a specific case, or for one side of an argument. Her status as a potential partner isn't a constant thing. It's completely dependent on a very unique set of circumstances. And if those circumstances aren't there, the whole idea is off the table. Simple as that.
Okay, so what are these incredibly strict conditions? Well, the text gets really specific about not only the situation, but the exact type of woman this whole logic could even possibly apply to.
The first, and honestly, the most critical condition, is all about the woman herself. The text says this argument only applies to a woman known as a sphairini. Now, you might translate that as independent or self-willed, but in this context, that word carries a whole lot of specific and pretty heavy baggage.
Yeah, the commentary does not leave this up to interpretation at all. It spells out exactly what it means. A Vairini is a woman who is known to have already been with many other men. Because of this, her character is described as broken or compromised. And get this, the text explicitly says her conduct is comparable to that of a Visha or a courtesan. And it makes a point to add that this still applies even if she comes from a high caste.
Now, the text is super careful to draw a very sharp line in the sand here. It says you absolutely cannot compare this Sphairini to a Punarbu. That's a widow who is remarried. A Punarbu was with one other man, her first husband, and she's seen as respectable, even 1,000 times superior. The Sphairini, on the other hand, having been with many, is put into an entirely different category, and this distinction is absolutely crucial for the justification that's coming up next.
So this leads us right into the thorniest part of the whole argument, the question of dharma, righteous duty and moral conduct. How could anyone possibly argue that this act isn't a massive violation of religious and social law?
Well, the commentary makes an incredibly bold claim. It basically says that in this one specific scenario, with this one specific type of woman, the act will not cause injury to dharma. And why? Because it argues in this unique case there's no adharma to begin with. I know, that sounds like a total contradiction. So how on earth does the text even begin to defend that?
It defends it by digging deep into one of the most respected scriptures, the Upanishads. The entire argument hangs on this one single line from the Chandogya Upanishad, Na Kanchan Periharet, which means one should not reject any woman. Now, taken by itself, that sounds like a ridiculously broad statement, right?
But, as always, context is everything. This quote is not some general rule for social life. It's pulled from the description of a very specific mystical ritual known as the Vamadevya Saman. This is a rite where the act of lovemaking itself is framed as a sacred cosmic chant, basically an act of worship.
So here's how the commentary builds its case step by step. First, it interprets that Upanishadic rule to mean you shouldn't reject a woman who is actively and desperately seeking you out, as if she's part of this sacred ritual. Second, it argues that a very specific scriptural permission slip like this, one tied directly to worship, can actually override a general social rule. And therefore, the blanket ban on adultery just doesn't apply in the unique, almost sacred circumstance that they've constructed.
But even after all of that incredibly complex justification, the text throws in one last, and maybe the most important, condition. This is not about creating some kind of loophole for personal pleasure.
Let's look at the final, ultimate catch.
And it all comes down to this really powerful closing line. It's a warning. It says you must first be absolutely sure about the purity of the situation and the real reasons behind it. Only then one may proceed, but not merely from desire. That's the mic drop. That is the ultimate check on this entire argument. Simple lust or pleasure-seeking makes the whole thing invalid.
So, let's just recap Gonikaputra's argument. What we have here is an incredibly narrow exception, not some general license to do whatever you want. It only applies to a very specific type of woman whose character, in the text view, is already compromised. The entire justification is built on a very creative and unique reading of a ritual text. And, most importantly, the main motivation absolutely cannot be just the pursuit of pleasure.
And all of this leaves us with a really big question to think about. When we come across these ancient texts that are so complex and, let's be honest, pretty challenging to our modern way of thinking, how should we approach them? Do we see them as literal guidebooks for how to live? Or are they more like historical artifacts, showing us a society very different from our own? Or maybe are they just complex philosophical puzzles designed to push the boundaries of rules and exceptions? It's a great reminder that trying to understand the past is never, ever a simple thing.